The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long, lazy shadows across the peaceful suburban neighborhood. In the small, cozy house at the end of Meadowbrook Lane lived Martha Jennings, a 62-year-old widow, known for her simple lifestyle and unassuming presence. Martha had lived in this house for over 30 years, ever since her late husband, Harold, bought it as their forever home. To the neighbors, Martha was just the sweet old lady with a well-kept yard and a knack for baking the best apple pie in the county. What they didn't know was that Martha had once been a highly decorated explosives expert in the Army. She had quietly retired after Harold's death, spending her days tending her roses, crocheting on the porch, and chatting with her cat, Whiskers. One crisp fall morning, as Martha was sipping her morning coffee, she noticed some unusual commotion across the street. Trucks. Men in hard hats. A sign being hammered into the ground. Curiosity piqued. Martha wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and shuffled over to see what the fuss was about. "Excuse me," Martha asked a man in a neon vest. "What's going on here?" He barely glanced at her, more focused on the clipboard in his hand. "New playground for the HOA. We're expanding the park. Gonna go right over that empty lot there." He gestured toward the piece of land directly in front of Martha's house, her front yard. Martha's heart sank. "That's my yard," she said quietly. The man raised an eyebrow, finally giving her his attention. "Ma'am, this land's been cleared for public use by the HOA. They've got the permits and everything." It was the first Martha had heard of it. Clutching her shawl tighter, she hurried back to her house and called the homeowners association. A curt, nasal voice answered. "Yes, Mrs. Jennings, the project was approved last month at the community meeting. Since you didn't attend, we assumed there were no objections," the HOA president, Nancy Carter, explained, her tone dripping with condescension. "But no one told me. You can't just take my yard," Martha argued, a rare fire in her usually calm voice. "The land technically falls under the community property category since it wasn't fenced off or explicitly marked as private. It's all perfectly legal. We sent notifications to all residents," Nancy replied, clearly annoyed. Martha hung up, her mind spinning. She couldn't believe it. The HOA had stolen her front yard without so much as a knock on her door. Anger bubbled up, but so did something else, a spark of her old strategic thinking. "All right," Martha whispered to herself. "If they want my yard so bad, they'll get it." She pulled out a dusty box from the attic, labeled Harold's Papers. Among the faded photos and love letters was what she was looking for, the deed to the land, clearly stating it belonged solely to the Jennings family. But that wasn't the most interesting part. As she thumbed through the old documents, she found a map, drawn in Harold's meticulous hand, marked Restricted Zone, Minefield, deactivated. Her pulse quickened as memories flooded back. Decades ago, Harold had bought the land cheap because it had once been part of a military training ground. Though the mines were technically disarmed, Martha knew better than to take it at face value. She herself had supervised similar operations. Sometimes, one or two didn't deactivate completely. A plan began to form in her mind, one that required patience, precision, and just a little bit of drama. Martha couldn't help but smile. They thought she was just an old lady who wouldn't put up a fight. They were wrong. The next morning, Martha contacted an old Army buddy, Frank. "Hey, Frank. Need a favor and some official-looking signs. You remember that old project on Meadowbrook?" A week later, the HOA's playground plans were in full swing. Workers were digging, setting up fences, and laying the groundwork. Martha watched from her porch, knitting calmly. Then, just as one of the workers started digging near the center, Martha sprang into action. She hurried down the steps, waving her arms. "Stop. Stop right there." The foreman looked at her with irritation. "Ma'am, we've got a schedule here. Please stay back." Martha held up a laminated sign she'd made with Frank's help. "Caution. Former military minefield. Do not disturb soil." The workers froze. The foreman scoffed. "Lady, this is some kind of joke?" Martha pointed to the spot on the map and recited the military code from memory, her voice calm but firm. "This entire area was part of a mine-clearing project back in the 70s. My husband was in charge of deactivating the mines. Not all of them were cleared. You dig too deep, you might just set one off." A murmur of panic swept through the workers. The foreman hesitated, unsure of whether to believe her. Martha stood her ground, unwavering. He made a call to the HOA, and within minutes, Nancy arrived, heels clicking angrily on the pavement. "Martha, this is ridiculous. You're holding up progress." Nancy snapped. Martha handed her the deed and the map. "I own this land. And this is a former military site. Your project is not just illegal, it's dangerous. You didn't do a proper land survey. Nancy's face paled. You're bluffing. Martha leaned in, lowering her voice. Go ahead. Dig. Maybe you'll be lucky. Maybe not. But when something goes wrong, it'll be your signature on the permits. Panic spread among the workers, who refused to dig another inch. Nancy frantically made calls to legal advisors, while Martha calmly watched, a triumphant glint in her eye. Later that evening, the HOA's project was halted indefinitely, pending an official investigation. Martha, sipping tea on her porch, felt a sense of justice. She knew the mines were likely harmless, but the risk, combined with the legality of the deed, was enough to stop the HOA in their tracks. The once dismissive HOA president now looked at Martha not as a feeble old woman, but as a formidable opponent, one who had just single-handedly taken down their grand plans without lifting a finger. As the sun set, Martha couldn't help but laugh softly to herself. Sometimes, people forget that strength comes in many forms. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room turns out to be the most explosive. The next morning, Martha woke to the sound of hurried voices and the harsh clang of metal against metal. She peered through her lace curtains and saw a line of HOA board members, including Nancy, gathered on the edge of her yard. They were pointing, whispering, and occasionally glancing nervously toward her house. She smiled, a rare, satisfied grin stretching across her face. The battle had only just begun. Martha dressed carefully, choosing a simple, floral dress and her sturdy garden boots. She wrapped her favorite shawl around her shoulders, the one Harold had given her for their 20th anniversary, and stepped out onto her front porch. The air was crisp, tinged with the faint scent of morning dew and freshly cut grass, mixed now with the metallic tang of nervous sweat from the cluster of HOA members. As she approached, the group fell silent, their eyes darting between her and the laminated sign she had posted the day before. It hung crookedly from the temporary fence they had put up, the bold, military-style lettering stark against the gentle autumn backdrop. Caution, former military minefield, do not disturb soil. Nancy stepped forward, a forced smile plastered on her face. Her perfectly styled hair and manicured nails seemed out of place against the gritty backdrop of half-dug trenches and piles of construction equipment. She adjusted her blazer, trying to appear in control, but the small tremor in her hands betrayed her. Martha, she began, her tone sweet but brittle, we've had a little misunderstanding here. Surely you can see that this playground is for the benefit of the entire community. It's a place for children to play, for families to gather. I'm sure you want to be a good neighbor and support this project. Martha clasped her hands calmly in front of her. Nancy, she replied, her voice steady and clear, I have always supported this community. I baked pies for the summer fair, I helped organize the charity yard sale, and I've even planted flowers around the entrance sign. But this is my land. And you tried to steal it without so much as a polite conversation. Nancy's jaw tightened, the smile dropping from her face. Steal is a strong word, Martha. The HOA simply utilized an unused, unfenced section of land, which, according to our bylaws, falls under community property. You didn't contest it when we posted the notice. Martha leaned in, her eyes locking onto Nancy's. That's where you're wrong. You see, this isn't just a patch of grass. It's private property with a legal deed. And, as you should have discovered during your so-called site survey, it also happens to be a former military site. You're lucky no one triggered anything yesterday. That would have been quite the lawsuit. Nancy's face flushed a deep, angry red, her perfectly applied foundation doing little to mask the heat rising in her cheeks. She turned to the other board members, who were shuffling awkwardly, avoiding eye contact. One of them, a balding man with sweat beading on his forehead, whispered something in her ear. She nodded sharply, then turned back to Martha, the practiced politician's smile once again stretching her lips. Well, Martha, I suppose we should revisit this. Perhaps we can come to a compromise. Maybe we could even help cover the cost of fencing your yard, to clearly mark the boundaries and avoid future misunderstandings. Martha tilted her head, pretending to consider the offer, though she had already made up her mind. She had been underestimated once too often by these people, and she wasn't about to back down now. She smiled, sweet and sharp. That's a generous offer, Nancy. But I think I'll pass. I've grown rather fond of my open front yard, and I like the view. Besides, the paperwork I found suggests that digging too deeply here might still be risky. I'd hate for anyone to get hurt. Nancy's eyes narrowed. She opened her mouth to argue but was cut off by the sound of approaching sirens. Everyone turned as two military-style Humvees rolled up the street, stopping just outside Martha's fence. Uniformed men with serious faces stepped out, each bearing the emblem of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. At their head was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a graying buzz cut and a jawline chiseled from stone. His name tag read Colonel Thompson. "Mrs. Jennings," he called out, his voice booming with the authority of a man used to being obeyed. Martha stepped forward, nodding. "Colonel Thompson, I see you got my message." Nancy's eyes darted between Martha and the colonel, her confusion palpable. The other board members had begun to retreat, inching away from the yard as if expecting it to explode at any moment. Thompson approached Martha, his steely eyes scanning the yard before locking onto her. "Ma'am, we received your report about the potential for unexploded ordnance. Given the history of this area, we're required to conduct a thorough investigation to ensure public safety." He turned to Nancy and her group, his gaze hardening. "I understand you were planning construction here without proper clearance?" Nancy stammered, her professional veneer crumbling. "We didn't. I mean, the survey didn't show. This is just a playground." Thompson didn't flinch. "A playground built over potentially unstable ground. Ma'am, if even one of those old charges is still live, this whole area could become a danger zone." Nancy took a shaky step back, her heels sinking into the soft earth. But, this is private property. We had permits." Thompson glanced at Martha, who gave him a small, knowing nod. He returned his attention to Nancy, his jaw tightening. "Permits don't override federal safety regulations, ma'am. Until this site is cleared and certified safe, any further construction will be considered a federal offense. I'd advise you to stand down." Martha watched as Nancy's carefully constructed world began to crumble. The board members, sensing a sinking ship, started to slip away one by one, mumbling weak excuses about prior commitments. As Thompson signaled to his men, who began unloading equipment and marking off the area with bright yellow caution tape, Nancy turned back to Martha, her face a twisted mask of frustration and barely contained rage. "This isn't over, Martha," she spat, her voice a low hiss. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Martha smiled, her blue eyes twinkling with a spark that hadn't been there in years. "Oh, I think I do. But the question is, Nancy, do you?" With that, she turned and strolled back to her porch, whiskers winding around her ankles as if sensing his owner's victory. She settled into her favorite rocking chair, the warm morning sun on her face, and took a long, satisfying sip of her now cool coffee. Nancy might not have known it yet, but the fight was already over. She had tangled with the wrong old lady, one who had spent a lifetime defusing far more dangerous threats than a petty HOA president. And now, Martha had the upper hand, and she wasn't about to let go. As the colonel's men began their work, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers and stolen glances toward the little house at the end of the lane, where a quiet, unassuming woman had just turned the tide in a battle she never sought but had prepared for all the same. As the days passed, the makeshift barriers around Martha's front yard transformed from hastily hung caution tape to a full-scale military cordon. Soldiers in camouflage uniforms and hard hats moved purposefully around the property, scanning the ground with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar. Bright orange cones and sturdy metal signs now marked the perimeter, each one shouting "Danger! Former military site, do not disturb soil." The once quiet cul-de-sac had become a spectacle, drawing curious onlookers and nervous whispers from the neighbors. Children who used to ride their bikes past Martha's house now crossed to the opposite side of the street, casting anxious glances at the buzzing machinery and stern-faced soldiers. The HOA members, who once marched confidently around the neighborhood enforcing petty rules about mailbox heights and lawn colors, now moved quickly past Martha's house, heads down, avoiding eye contact. Martha watched it all from her front porch, a warm cup of chamomile tea in her hands and whiskers curled contentedly at her feet. She felt the shift in the air, the subtle change in power dynamics. For the first time in years, she felt not just in control, but respected, or perhaps feared. It was a heady, intoxicating feeling. Nancy, however, was far from ready to admit defeat. The HOA president had built her little empire on control, on bending others to her will through bureaucracy and thinly veiled threats. She wasn't about to let a frail old woman derail her grand plans, especially not one who had publicly humiliated her in front of the entire board and half the neighborhood. No, Nancy had other plans, and she intended to push back with everything she had. It started with the letters. Neatly typed, crisp white envelopes with the HOA's official seal, dropped into Martha's mailbox with a cold efficiency. The first demanded she remove the unauthorized military signage from her property, citing HOA regulations against unsightly structures and unapproved modifications. Martha ignored it. The second letter arrived 2 days later, threatening daily fines for unauthorized use of government symbols and failure to maintain a visually harmonious front yard. Martha chuckled as she tossed it onto the growing pile of ignored HOA correspondence. Then came the visits. Nancy herself, flanked by 2 other board members, appeared on Martha's porch one chilly morning. They wore forced smiles, their eyes darting nervously to the soldiers moving steadily in the background. "Martha," Nancy began, her tone dripping with forced sweetness, "we need to talk about your decorations." She gestured to the military signs and bright yellow hazard tape flapping gently in the autumn breeze. Martha took a slow sip of her tea, letting the steam rise between them, before setting the cup down deliberately. "Decorations," she replied, her voice tinged with faint confusion. "Oh, you mean the legally mandated safety markers put in place by the United States Army Corps of Engineers? I'm afraid I can't touch those. You'll have to take it up with them." Nancy's smile tightened, her perfectly whitened teeth grinding together for just a moment. "You're making the entire neighborhood look like a war zone," she snapped, losing her carefully constructed composure. "You're scaring the children. You're driving down property values. This isn't just about your little patch of grass anymore, Martha. This affects all of us." Martha leaned back in her chair, her fingers gently stroking Whisker's soft fur. She let the silence stretch, watching Nancy's eyes flicker with barely contained rage. Finally, she spoke, her tone cool and measured. "Funny. I don't recall the HOA worrying about my property values when you tried to steal my yard for a playground. But if you're truly concerned about the children, perhaps you should have considered the safety implications before you started digging without a proper survey." Nancy's face turned a dangerous shade of red, her hands clenching into tight fists. One of the other board members, a nervous man with a receding hairline and sweat beading on his forehead, reached out as if to calm her, but she shook him off. "You haven't heard the last of this, Martha," she hissed, turning sharply on her heel and marching back down the steps, her heels clicking angrily against the worn wood. Martha watched her go, a small, satisfied smile creeping across her lips. She had won this skirmish, but she knew the war was far from over. Days turned into weeks, and the situation continued to escalate. Nancy escalated her attacks, filing formal complaints with the local zoning board and even attempting to have Martha's property taxes reassessed. She tried to rally the other homeowners, organizing emergency board meetings and circulating petitions aimed at forcing Martha to comply with the HOA's demands. But the tide had turned, and support for Nancy's crusade began to wane as whispers of her failed power grab spread through the community. Then came the final blow. One crisp, clear morning, just as the leaves were beginning to turn shades of amber and crimson, a black SUV with government plates rolled up to Martha's house. Out stepped Colonel Thompson, his expression unreadable behind his dark aviator sunglasses. Martha rose to greet him, feeling a slight flutter of nerves for the first time since this whole ordeal had begun. "Mrs. Jennings," Thompson said, his tone as crisp as the autumn air, "I have some news." Martha's heart skipped a beat. Had Nancy finally managed to twist the system in her favor? Was this the part where the government turned against her, where her carefully laid plans unraveled? Thompson removed his sunglasses, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "We've completed our survey of your property. You were right. Several old charges remain buried deep beneath the surface. Given the risks, this land will need to be officially reclassified as a hazardous zone. The HOA has been notified, and all their plans to develop this site have been permanently canceled." Martha exhaled, a slow, deep breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She smiled, her eyes sparkling with a mixture of relief and quiet triumph. "Thank you, Colonel," she replied, her voice steady. "Thank you for taking this seriously." Thompson nodded, his expression softening for a moment. "We owe you more than thanks, ma'am. You likely saved lives by bringing this to our attention." He extended his hand, which Martha took firmly, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in years. As Thompson turned to leave, Martha called after him. "Colonel, one more thing. If the HOA tries anything else, if they keep harassing me." Thompson smiled, a small, knowing grin that reminded her of her late husband. "Let us know, ma'am. We'll make sure they understand the full weight of federal law." As the black SUV pulled away, Martha stood on her porch, the cool autumn breeze rustling the leaves around her feet. She watched as the remaining soldiers packed up their equipment and removed the last of the caution tape. Her yard, her land, had been secured. The threat had been neutralized. Martha turned, a satisfied smile spreading across her face as she stepped back into her home. She had won. She had stood her ground, outmaneuvered her enemies, and reclaimed what was rightfully hers. And in doing so, she had reminded the entire neighborhood that some battles are won not with brute force, but with patience, cunning, and the quiet, unshakable resolve of someone who has faced far greater adversaries than a petty HOA president. As the chill of autumn gave way to the biting winds of early winter, the neighborhood began to change. The whispers had turned into full-blown conversations, and Martha's quiet victory had become the stuff of local legend. She had not just won a battle over her front yard, she had shattered the illusion of the HOA's absolute control. For the first time in years, homeowners began to question the bylaws they had so blindly accepted. Neighbors who had once avoided Martha's house out of fear of being seen as sympathetic to a troublemaker now waved to her as they walked by, their cautious glances replaced by respectful nods. Some even stopped by to chat, sharing stories of their own small rebellions against the HOA's petty tyranny. But Nancy, of course, had not taken her defeat lightly. She was a woman who thrived on control, whose perfectly polished life depended on the illusion of absolute authority. The thought of being outmaneuvered by a frail old woman had driven her to near madness. She had become a ghost of her former self, her usually flawless appearance slipping as she struggled to regain her grip on the neighborhood. Her once meticulously kept garden had withered under the weight of her neglect, and the Christmas lights she had always been the first to hang now lay tangled in a pile on her front porch. Martha, however, felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time since Harold's passing, she felt alive. She had become a symbol of quiet resistance, of the power that came from standing your ground. She had spent years blending into the background, letting life pass her by, but now she felt the old spark returning, the fire of a woman who had once commanded respect on military bases around the world. One morning, as Martha sipped her tea on the porch, she noticed a small, nervous-looking man approaching her gate. He was dressed in a cheap suit, his thin, balding head gleaming in the winter sun. He hesitated at the gate, glancing back at his car as if reconsidering his decision. Martha watched him for a moment, then called out, her voice steady and strong. "Come on up, son. I won't bite." The man jumped slightly, then forced a tight-lipped smile and shuffled up the path. "Mrs. Jennings?" he asked, his voice thin and wavering. "My name is Michael Harper. I'm an attorney representing the HOA. Martha raised an eyebrow, setting her teacup down with deliberate care. "Oh, what can I do for you, Mr. Harper?" He cleared his throat, pulling a sheaf of papers from his briefcase and adjusting his glasses nervously. "I'm here to discuss a settlement. The HOA would like to resolve this matter amicably, without further escalation." Martha leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. "Amicably?" she repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "Is that what Nancy called it when she tried to steal my yard? Or when she sent her little letters threatening to find me into submission?" Harper flushed, shuffling his papers awkwardly. I understand your frustration, Mrs. Jennings. Truly, I do. But the HOA believes it would be in everyone's best interest to put this matter behind us. They're prepared to offer a significant reduction in your annual dues, as well as assistance with landscaping and maintenance, in exchange for the removal of the military signage. Martha's eyes narrowed, her mind working quickly. She had no intention of backing down, but she saw an opportunity here, a chance to turn Nancy's desperation into something more permanent. She forced herself to remain calm, masking the flicker of triumph that sparked in her chest. "Mr. Harper," she said slowly, her voice like the first crack of ice on a winter pond, "I appreciate your offer, but I'm afraid I'm not interested in a discount. What I want is for the HOA to acknowledge their mistake, to admit that they tried to overstep their bounds. I want them to formally retract their claims to my yard, to remove all mentions of it from their bylaws, and to issue a public apology for their actions." Harper's eyes widened, his thin lips parting in shock. "A public apology?" he stammered. "Mrs. Jennings, I don't think you understand the position you're in. The HOA has deep pockets and a team of lawyers at their disposal. They can drag this out in court for years if necessary." Martha's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Oh, I understand perfectly, Mr. Harper. But do you understand the position they're in? The federal government now has a vested interest in this land. The Army Corps of Engineers has deemed it a hazardous site, and any further attempts by the HOA to claim it could result in criminal charges for endangering public safety. Do you really think Nancy wants to take that risk?" Harper paled, his fingers trembling slightly as he shuffled his papers again, searching for a rebuttal. Martha watched him with a mixture of amusement and pity. She had faced far more intimidating opponents in her lifetime, men with actual power, not just the illusion of it. "I suggest you take this message back to your client," she continued, her voice firm and unyielding. "I want a written retraction, a full apology, and a guarantee that my property will never again be targeted by the HOA. If I don't receive those by the end of the month, I'll be more than happy to let the Army handle this matter." I'm sure they'd be interested to hear about the HOA's attempts to interfere with a federally protected site. Harper stood frozen for a moment, his mouth working soundlessly as he tried to process her words. Finally, he managed a weak nod, his eyes avoiding hers as he stuffed the papers back into his briefcase and stumbled down the steps, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste to escape. Martha watched him go, her heart pounding with the familiar rush of victory. She felt a deep, satisfying warmth spread through her chest as she leaned back in her chair, the winter sun warming her face. She had won again, and this time, the victory felt even sweeter. As she reached down to scratch Whiskers behind the ears, she couldn't help but chuckle softly. She had once been content to live quietly, to fade into the background and let the world move on without her. But now, she realized, she still had some fight left in her. She had become a force to be reckoned with, a quiet storm that had shaken the very foundations of her once peaceful neighborhood. And as the cold winter wind whispered through the bare branches above, she knew that this was just the beginning. Winter settled over Meadowbrook Lane like a heavy, silent shroud. Snow dusted the tops of mailboxes and blanketed the manicured lawns, muffling the sharp edges of the once immaculate neighborhood. Christmas lights twinkled from every roofline, their warm, flickering glow casting long, dancing shadows on the snow-covered streets. It was a picturesque scene, the kind of place you might see on a postcard or in the background of a holiday movie. But beneath the festive facade, the tension simmered, thick and palpable. Martha sat in her favorite armchair by the front window, a steaming cup of peppermint tea in her hands, her eyes fixed on the faint tire tracks still visible in her driveway where Michael Harper had made his hasty retreat days earlier. She had watched the nervous lawyer stumble down her steps, nearly losing his balance on a patch of black ice, his breath steaming in the cold air as he fumbled with his car door. She had seen the panic in his eyes, the barely concealed dread as he realized just how badly his clients had miscalculated. The following morning, a heavy manila envelope had appeared in her mailbox, the HOA's official seal stamped in red wax on the flap. She had taken her time opening it, savoring the crackle of the thick paper and the sharp, metallic scent of fresh ink. Inside, she found exactly what she had demanded, a formal, written apology from the HOA, signed by Nancy herself, along with a notarized statement officially retracting their claims to her yard and promising to never again interfere with her property. It was a small but deeply satisfying victory, the final, tangible proof that she had won. But Martha knew better than to rest on her laurels. She had spent too many years in the military, too many sleepless nights worrying about hidden threats and unseen dangers, to believe that Nancy would simply give up. The woman had built her reputation on control, on bending others to her will, and she would not go quietly into the night. If anything, Martha's victory had likely only fueled her desire for revenge, stoking the fires of her wounded pride into a full-blown inferno. Martha was proven right just days later, when she received a second letter from the HOA, this one not from Harper, but from a different law firm, one she recognized as a notorious litigation mill, known for their aggressive tactics and willingness to drag even the smallest disputes into protracted legal battles. It was a thinly veiled threat, a reminder that the HOA had deep pockets and long memories, and that they would not hesitate to bury her in paperwork and court fees if she continued to resist. Martha smiled as she read the letter, her eyes sparkling with the familiar, predatory glint of a soldier preparing for battle. She had been expecting this, had even planned for it. She had spent the past few weeks quietly gathering allies, reaching out to her fellow homeowners, planting the seeds of dissent that had now begun to take root throughout the neighborhood. She had spoken to the elderly couple down the street, whose flower beds had been uprooted without permission for a new sidewalk. She had listened to the young single mother who had been fined for having a non-conforming mailbox. She had even reached out to the retired Marine 2 doors down, whose beloved dog had been the target of repeated noise complaints from the HOA. Together, they had formed an unlikely alliance, a loose network of disgruntled homeowners who had grown tired of Nancy's petty tyranny and who were now more than willing to push back against her iron-fisted rule. They had met in secret, huddling in living rooms and basements, their whispered conversations growing louder and more confident as the weeks went by. They had drafted letters, signed petitions, and even filed a formal request for an independent audit of the HOA's finances, suspecting correctly, as it would later turn out, that Nancy had been siphoning funds from the community treasury to finance her increasingly lavish lifestyle. Martha had kept her role in the uprising deliberately low-key, content to play the quiet, unassuming strategist behind the scenes, feeding information to her allies and watching as they slowly but surely dismantled the foundation of Nancy's power. She had seen this tactic work time and again in the military, had watched as entire regimes crumbled from within when their leaders lost the loyalty of their followers. She knew that Nancy's days as HOA president were numbered, that her carefully constructed facade of control was beginning to crack, and that it was only a matter of time before it came crashing down around her. That time finally came one cold, clear morning in late December, when the HOA board held their annual election. It was a tense, standing-room-only affair, the small community center packed to the rafters with homeowners, many of whom had never bothered to attend a board meeting before. They watched in stunned silence as the votes were tallied, the hush broken only by the soft, rhythmic ticking of the old wall clock above the door. When the final count was announced, a low murmur rippled through the crowd, growing louder and more jubilant as the significance of the numbers sank in. Nancy had lost, not just by a narrow margin, but by a landslide, her years of unchecked power and petty tyranny finally coming back to haunt her. She stood frozen behind the podium, her face a mask of stunned disbelief, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the wooden edge as the reality of her defeat crashed over her like a tidal wave. Martha watched from the back of the room, her heart swelling with a fierce, quiet pride as she saw her neighbors rise to their feet, cheering and clapping, their faces alight with the exhilaration of hard-won freedom. She caught the eye of the retired Marine, who flashed her a knowing grin and a sharp, respectful nod, and she returned the gesture, feeling for the first time in years like the soldier she had once been. As she made her way to the door, slipping quietly into the cold winter night, Martha felt a deep, satisfying warmth spread through her chest. She had won. She had not just reclaimed her yard, but her voice, her power, and her place in the world. She had reminded her neighbors, and herself, that sometimes the quietest, most unassuming people are the ones who pose the greatest threat to tyranny, that the fiercest warriors often were the most unassuming disguises. As she stepped onto the snow-covered sidewalk, the sound of the cheering crowd still echoing in her ears, Martha allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She had become a force to be reckoned with, a quiet storm that had shaken the very foundations of her once peaceful neighborhood. And as she made her way home, her breath misting in the cold night air, she knew that she had finally found her way back to the life she had thought she had lost forever.